So, so that cut a second. So you want to tell us about parties and factions again? You're right.
So I'm just saying that you know, the founders, they predicted there would be factions. You can't avoid factions. That's what Madison says, that, right, in one of his most famous essays. You can't prevent factions, but you can prevent a kind of unifying interest, a kind of conglomeration of factions to such an extent that one faction will be able to dominate the entire system. But it's very interesting that even in the first generation, you get really two parties that form.
Mm-hmm.
And so, although a party system is not envisaged, I think it's not present as such in the language of the Constitution, it ends up forming very quickly. I mean, it changes, of course, over time. Different interests, different, parties form. Some, Hamilton's party, the Federalist Party, eventually is kind of disintegrates.
Yeah.
And then, something else is formed. But it's nevertheless, there's still two kind of poles.
Both do, really, because the Democratic Republican Party kind of folds out because it comes up against Jacksonian Democrats.
Yeah. That's a bit later though.
Jackson formed what is the modern Democrat Party, and basically Lincoln formed what is the modern Republican Party.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So anyway, so that's bye. So do you want to keep going?
Yeah. So I think fundamentally you're right, and those divisions, and we've talked about them before, and we'll talk about them again. So but we'll highlight it here. So obviously Hamilton effectively represented the educated, the elites, urban manufacturers, creditors, the North, anti-slavery, and Atlantic-facing, pro-England, anti-French wing of the party. So all of those divides. And the Jeffersonian democracy represented rural areas, farmers, simple American lives, the debtors, people who wanted to print money, people who wanted westward expansion, pro-French, pro-Southern, pro-slavery. I think if you find, and that's basically the Hamilton and Jeffersonian divide. And so there's a fault line. This country, as we talked about before, had an unbelievable number of divisions, and they naturally folded into two camps, which would effectively become the two camps that lead to the Civil War eventually. And to a degree today, Trump is the heir to the Jeffersonian legacy, and Kamala Harris Biden is the heir to the Hamiltonian legacy, more or less, with some tweaks and some switches on sides. But
yeah, in the sense that, I guess, if you want to put it very, very, but very vaguely, the Republicans try to represent them, at least say that they represent more limited government, government, and the Democrats are more for stronger government that can solve social issues, right?
Yeah.
Although, the irony is, of course, the parties have switched.
Yeah, well, there's some of the sides have switched around, I guess, but you would still say urban Democrats are the urban party to the Republicans rural. That's still a clear divide. I think the divides are still there. Maybe they're just not all in the same line, you know what I mean, as they were before. Because I would say urban rural, Democrats are urban to the Republicans rural in modern times, but Republicans probably are the party more of the rich than the Democrats, although that might be switching under Trump as well. You know what I mean? So I think it's fluid. And you can see that when we get into the civil rights course, you'll see how on race they switched between the Democrats and the Republicans, obviously.
Yeah.
The Republican Party is the party of Lincoln and Trump, and the Democratic Party is the party of extreme Southern racism and Barack Obama. So you've got a very much a big switch in this. I confused the hell out of my students in year 13.
It's very confusing, but I mean, it's really the 1960s where these things change. They flip.
I think they start to change under Woodrow Wilson and FDR. I think FDR is where they actually change, but I think LBJ consolidates that transformation.
Yeah, but yeah.
Because it's officially the the African-American vote goes Democrat under FDR in the New Deal. That's when the
Yeah,
numbers massively change. But obviously,
yeah,
the
because
civil rights bill under FDR, under LBJ, is the fundamentally most important, like,
yeah, yeah. But we're going to confuse everybody with this. Don't worry about it. I
yeah.
mean, it's
But
too
they
far
do
ahead.
this as well. I mean, a lot of the students do
Oh,
politics as well, so they can track out
oh,
votes.
okay.
But
Oh,
I think
good. Okay.
sometimes it helps to get a handle if they're looking at the traits, they can kind of track it back as well. And it's also
Yeah,
it's important for the year 13 course. That's why these themes run all the way through. And then if you're
yeah,
looking at the negatives of this, and we'll deal with that to flip onto the positives. So the government is functional. It does work in a lot of ways, and we'll talk more about economics specifically, but we'll deal with the other problems, which was the rebellions and the international trade. So on terms of the negative, the major issues of slavery is not dealt with. And this would eventually lead to the Civil War. So even though they found that compromise, it is still kicking the can down the road. They're not dealing with slavery. It isn't dealt with, and it comes back to bite them afterwards. And they had to introduce a Fugitive Slave Act to placate the South. And the South were only happy because of this and the booming cotton prices. And that booming cotton prices allows them to resist the
yeah,
transformation of their economy. And there's a lot of resentment in rural America because, again, they're the losers in this, as they are so many times in American history. It's like whenever they're needed, they're used, and then they're abandoned when they're not needed. That's kind of their role in American history. But they have the Whiskey Rebellion. Obviously, it's a resistance over taxation, and this is a first test because it's the government now has the right to tax. They decide to put the tax on whiskey, and it's not coincidental that whiskey was the main drink of the rural backcountry, who are Jeffersonian supporters. And Hamilton decides to put the tax on whiskey, not on any other drink. And it really hits that rural area more than anyone else. And now you get the taxation again. They can't they can't say no taxation without representation because they're now represented. But that anti-taxation, anti-free rights, like freedom-loving drive of the westward expansion of the United States is back again. And they need to subvert it. And the difference this time is they can tax. They enforce that tax. There's a rebellion. But in contrast to Shays' rebellion, the government now has an army or can raise a militia. So Washington and Hamilton lead 13,000 militia and crush the Whiskey Rebellion. The one and only time that a US president has led soldiers into war. And of course, it's the man who led their battles in the other parts as well. So
but this time
in
Washington
terms of
doesn't
its,
lose.
huh?
That's unusual. Washington doesn't actually lose this one.
Yeah, but I mean, if you're beating up some whiskey drinkers in the backcountry, they can't even beat that one. I don't
I
know
don't
what's
know. Don't underestimate Washington's capacity
to lose. Yeah,
I'm
but he
kidding.
made his name on. Um, then,
Yeah,
but this shows. I mean, fundamentally, the Whiskey Rebellion shows the difference. If you compare that and how Shays' Rebellion was handled under the Articles of Confederation,
yeah,
you can
that's
see
right.
that fundamentally two of the big problems was they couldn't raise taxes and they couldn't deal with internal disorder. Both of those
Yeah.
things are dealt with in the Whiskey Rebellion.
Yeah, and so basically the one, and that's that's solved because now Congress can tax directly.
Yeah.
Right. It doesn't
They had
have
to
to.
assert
It's
it
not
because the people rejected this taxation, even though Congress has the
absolutely.
right. The rural areas still reject it because they're the bedrock of the anti-federalists, the bedrock of Jeffersonian Democrat Republicans.
Yeah.
I think so. But fundamentally, you would argue probably it was a success. Again, it was certainly more successful in the short term and dealt with the major issues that were facing the Republic. I think what you could argue with the New Republic is it still didn't deal with the long-term and fundamental, like, crux point problems underneath the country.
Yeah.
And that's where it fails in the same way as the Articles of Confederation. So then if you're looking at, we'll take westward expansion next, because in general, so there were successful military campaigns against Native Americans to take their land. So that is a positive for the government. They were able to take more off the Native Americans. But in a negative way, Jefferson saw the country as rural and westward expansion to strengthen the tradition of 80% farmers in the country. Now, this showed the divide because Jefferson wanted the country to expand further rural and westward, whereas while Hamilton saw the future with trade over the Atlantic Ocean rather than focus on the West and with Britain. So this westward expansion strengthen those divides and again push the divides, and especially the divides on slavery, because that westward expansion really did open up the idea of, are we bringing slavery into these new territories? Yes or no? Is this fundamentally going to lead? What kind of America are we going to have? Can they even stop them expanding westward? Of course, this then pushed into having clashes with Native Americans on the frontier. So that was fundamentally a big problem for them as well, because it opened up further conflicts with Native Americans. And that was one of the reasons they didn't want to go in that direction in the first place. So all the problems, I don't believe the problems have changed between the articles for westward expansion. I think it is still fundamentally the same problem, and it's still fundamentally not dealt with. So Washington failed to contain westward expansion, and the Land Act of 1796 was not really successful, because it was working on the idea of disposing of lands in the Ohio River area, and it led to a rush into the territory, and there was again a lot of problems in terms of regulating this westward expansion. So I think it didn't do any better deal. I don't think the new government could deal with westward expansion any better than the Articles of Confederation, and the problems were still there, and what it led to was still there. And it just showed that realistically, the American government, despite now having a federal government, was powerless to stop this westward expansion that they didn't really want.
I don't know. Yeah, I think I agree to the extent. I think the westward expansion is the biggest, let's say, negative in the sense that because they had to compromise on the status of slavery in the Constitution, there's this big ambiguity that's festering away, and it means that every new piece of large piece of land that you colonize and occupy, develop, it leads to the ultimate question: is it going to be slave or free? Right, and that's a massive question. And what I would add is that the fact that there's now the Constitution raises the stakes massively.
Yeah.
Because the question, is it going to be slave or free, actually determines the extent of your aggregate power in the Senate and in the Congress, right?
Yeah.
That's going to matter, right? So it's the huge question is going to be the proportion, the balance between the number of slave and the number of free states in Congress. And westward expansion is going to really be it's going to add a lot of tension to this, because it's not just the question of slavery itself, but also the question of representation and the relative leverage, the authority that the Southern interests are going to be able to impose, let's say, on the country as a whole. And I think the fact that there's now a federal government, this makes these questions really, really explosive questions, I think.
Yeah, and I think that on top of that, you're now dealing with the idea that they then come to the compromise of, like, when one free state comes in, one slave state has.
Yeah, that's right.
And the number of free states is increasing at this point as well, because, like I said, at the time of the Constitution's formation, it was 9 slave states to 6 free states. But that had rapidly moved. From not long beforehand, it was 15-0 to slave states. And so the South was worried about the rapidly increasing number of free states in the North, because obviously if they then were outnumbered, it would be probably unlikely, because there wasn't a militantly movement yet to ban slavery in the South, but I mean, they saw the writing on the wall. If it continued to move in that direction, they needed to expand slavery, and they needed to keep it in the Union as a strong marker for them to be able to maintain the institution.
Right, but I think it's actually the westward expansion and all of the problems that implies for government that is the kind of explosive energy that I guess leads to the Civil War. I think before this, sure, there were differences of opinion, but I don't think the differences between slave and free, I don't think those differences were nearly as radical as they became, in the 1830s, the 1840s.
No, but it was pulling up. I think the westward expansion was like pulling on the 2 threads. It was like pulling on the.
It's a kind of dynamo, isn't it? It's like the
Yeah.
engine that
Yeah.
drives increasing tensions.
Well, I
I
think
think.
there's all these divides, and the westward expansion is like pulling those divides. You know what I mean? It's like pulling them in two different directions.
Yeah.
And I think so
Yeah.
that it like the westward expansion, like going west tore the north and south apart
Yeah. Yeah.
effectively. Like, and
Yeah.
I think that is fundamentally why westward expansion is the crux. I just read the book on American revolutions that was arguing that westward expansion was more important than the north-south divide or slavery in terms of generating the economy. My students are supposed to have been doing like a 19th century American course over the summer, so they'll hopefully be able to come back and deal with these. I think it's fundamental to go into the African American civil rights, Native American civil rights, that all these divides are clear. And the last factor they had to deal with was economics, because obviously, as we said before, they couldn't pay people, they couldn't raise taxes, they couldn't deal with tariffs. So now they had that possibility. So we'll start with the negatives on this. The North and South were still split over slavery. So the economic models were still different. The South was still relying on slave labor. The North was starting to manufacture. So that divide was still being pulled on economics, and it was punted down the road. It wasn't dealt with. And the first raising of the whiskey tax led to the Whiskey Rebellion. But as we said, that was put down by the federal government. So, even though it caused problems, it was established that taxation was gonna happen. Led to a lot of resentment in rural America, because by the federal government taking over a clear bank and a mint meant that the rural poor debtors could no longer print money, and it was going to stop the inflation, but it led to a lot of resentment in rural America. Although at least now with taxation, they could actually be paid. And some of the small states with limited debt resented paying off the national government's debt, as they did, because they didn't believe it was part of their problem.
I think that's Hamilton's probably massive achievement was being able to deal with federal debt.
Yeah,
right.
That's what he's most famous for, obviously, because it's and like where it was positive for the U.S. government was that the Constitution established a right for the government to tax its citizens, at least on paper. And then I think the crushing of the Whiskey Rebellion enforced that right to taxation was a real right that they could enforce. I mean, Hamilton had written his report on the public credit to take on state debt at federal level and pay face value. Obviously, this having a federal government to back up debt meant that they could borrow. Because before this, it was impossible for the American government to borrow money because they had no ability to pay it back. So that ability to borrow and that ability to invest would allow the country to develop massively. Hamilton also established a new national bank. That national bank obviously backed up the currency of the dollar and allowed America to have a stable currency. And then he set up the US Mint as well. And with the US Mint, established that only the federal government had the right to print money. And that's fundamentally important because that eliminates immediately the ability to print money, which eliminates runaway inflation. And manufacturing was encouraged because Hamilton was driving up the idea of a more modern economy, especially in the North. And this meant that tariffs were put on foreign products because they were able to put tariffs on, and that protected the industry as it was growing. Although, of course, it would lead to higher consumer prices for domestic workers, which means
tariffs led to a lot of conflict, didn't it?
Yeah,
in
well,
the
especially
early
with
years.
South Carolina. Like later on, South Carolina was really upset with the tariffs that were placed on like tit for tat with products. Because they wanted to export out as well their products outside. But it's like for poorer people, it doesn't benefit them as always, because if you put tariffs on prices in free market economics, prices increase. So local industry can manufacture more, but you're paying more for the product because you can't go cheaper markets.
Can I add something that's not there on the list?
Yeah, go for it.
The one interesting problem is that of the court. I think we mentioned this already.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I mean, so it's interesting because the Constitution does not explicitly give the Supreme Court the right to strike down federal law if it's inconsistent with. So just to clarify, what does the Supreme Court do? What's its big thing? It's called judicial review. It means that it can scrutinize any law that Congress passes, that gets through, any bill. And if it contradicts a clause in the Constitution, it can get the court actually can strike it down. Okay, so that's a big deal. That's a huge deal that the Supreme Court can do that. What's really interesting is that Constitution doesn't say that the court can do that. Now, it doesn't say explicitly that it can't, but it's basically the court's power to do that comes about through a very weird case called Marbury versus Madison. Okay, which happened at, I think it was the end of Jay's administration. Was it the end of John Adams' administration, just before Hamilton became the third president.
Jefferson.
And it was, Jefferson. Hamilton was never president. Sorry, Jefferson was what I wanted to say.
This is. I'll just point out. This is outside. This is outside the dates of our course, but it's
sure.
So it's still interesting.
Sure, but it's still talk about it, it's still interesting. Yeah, it's
1803.
It's not absolutely critical, but it is interesting that the court is a major power now. It's a major political issue in American politics, and it will and it becomes so pretty quickly, right? Like there's the Dred Scott decision, for example. That's one of the major factors in building tensions to the Civil War. But it's interesting.
And the stripping of the civilized tribes and the Native Americans removing off their land when they decide that they don't have to honor any treaties with Native Americans because they're not actually citizens.
Yeah. So it's interesting that the Constitution hasn't really, defined the powers of the court. So I think that's just something to, maybe something.
Because it was an afterthought. They only came in at the last minute and they didn't really establish it. I don't think they saw it. And again, that's. Oh, sorry. Sorry, my throat was gone then. It was an afterthought. They weren't really thinking about it.
Yeah.
And it's like.
It's going to play a pretty big role, though.
Yeah, but that's because also they had then Marshall was the Supreme Court Justice. No, John Marshall was Supreme Court Justice, and he took on a very activist role for the Supreme Court. And Marshall was fundamental in the same way that Hamilton was fundamental for setting up the financial system. Madison was fundamental for setting up the Bill of Rights and the opposition. John Marshall was fundamental for setting up the role of the Supreme Court.
Yeah,
so they all fleshed it out. Like you had strong people in each role, fleshes it out, and it's still that battle. Even with the presidencies today, you have the idea of whether it's a imperial presidency or not. But either way, how well did the U.S. government deal with domestic problems it faced? I would say much better than under the Articles of Confederation. It could deal with rebellions. The Whiskey Rebellion compared to Shays Rebellion shows how far it dealt with the rebellions. The right to tax and to raise tariffs showed that it now had that power to generate money. There was a lot less insurrections in this time period. I think it dealt with most of the things it was set up to deal with, except westward expansion, which fundamentally led to the Civil War. So I think that while westward expansion was the only thing the Articles of Confederation sort of did, but kicked the can down the road, I think the Constitution continued to kick the can down the road and did the same thing. But where it was the only success of the Articles of Federation, it's the only real weakness of the new federal government.
Yeah, and kicking the can down the road, it makes it look like it's a failure, a failure of, I don't know, foresight.
Yeah,
but it might be worth. I don't know. I would be tempted to make the argument that it's not really a failure of foresight. It's just it's a problem. It's what's irreconcilable problem. It's a problem without a solution. So no matter how smart you are, there's not really any way of solving this issue.
Well, there was a civil war, and I'm still not sure that actually
Civil War is the worst possible. No, and the Civil War is the worst possible war. Civil War is the worst possible scenario.
Yeah. Well, I don't think either side went there by choice. I think they went there by, you just ran into that direction. I don't think either side felt there was any choice anymore.
Yeah, it feels like fate, though. I mean, to some extent, because it's really, I just don't know how you could ever have a compromise of this nature without.
No, but it was the same with
there.
It was the same with the battle between Parliament versus the rights of the colonial assemblies. It was going to inevitably end up in conflict. The same with this one.
Yeah. Okay. Cool.
Yeah. So do you think it was more effective, the new government, than the Articles of Federation in dealing with problems?
Yeah, for sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
I think it's pretty hard. It's possible, but not a little unconventional to make the opposing case, right?
Yeah.
So,
I think it's like I
um,
said, westward expansion and the underlying and not dealing with the underlying tensions, which, as you've said, might well have been impossible anyway, is the only thing you could really throw against it.
I mean, if you were very sophisticated, you might say that there is a kind of mystique. There's a veneration of the Constitution
Yeah.
that happens, pretty soon after, really,
Yeah.
even in like the second and third generations.
Yeah.
Not to mention today.
Yeah.
And that kind of mystique, there's a kind of almost religious reverence for the Constitution in the
Yeah.
US. And that's if you're a historian, you should be one should be suspicious of that. It's and is this kind of reverence, is that likely to cloud our judgment about how well it did in fact solve problems? That's if you wanted to go in the other direction, I'd probably go down make an argument along those lines. But still, I think that it's much easier to say that it does. It's pretty successful given all of the limitations and all of the problems that it had to deal with.
Yeah. I think fundamentally you can also look at it like it is true that the people who wrote about how successful the Articles of Federation were mostly federalists who wanted to get rid of it.
Right.
So
right.
I mean that's sort of never going to lead to and
it's called bias, right? Historical bias.
that and the Americans only write about winners. Anyone who's a loser in their history gets eliminated. So it's like, that's why it's constantly reshuffling its own legends, myths, and its own idea of itself.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
Cool. So let's move on to the next one. I think this one is like, how well did the American government handle relations with Britain and Spain in the period 1783 to 1796? I think I'll just highlight out the treaties, and then we can break down whether it was well or badly. So obviously, Jay Treaty in 1795 was with Britain, and the Pinckney Treaty in 1795 was with Spain. And fair to say that in America, the Pinckney Treaty is more regarded than the Jay Treaty, and that's probably because the Americans got exactly what they wanted. So in terms of what happened, what they got and what they didn't get, I suppose with the problems that they had with the Spanish was that there was no clear boundary in Florida or along the Mississippi River. They didn't have access to the Mississippi River, which is fundamentally problematic for especially westward settlers because they wanted to be able to export their goods through the territory, and they couldn't get there. It was difficult for them to take it across land all the way to the Atlantic seaboard. And there was actually a movement at this point. The British and the French, the Western colonies at one point reached out to the Spanish to see if they could join the Spanish Empire in order to get access to the Mississippi River. So this was fundamentally important for the Americans to tie these treaties down, because the people on the west of the Appalachians were looking at maybe joining with Britain or maybe joining with Spain. And this is why they also had the whip hand over the presidents about westward expansion, because it was like, in the end, especially Jefferson realized that you can't stem this tide. So you either go with it or you go against it. And there was a danger that a new second country would be formed in the Western eras. They didn't owe any loyalty to the States. And until they joined the Union or had the number of people to join, they didn't have anything. So these Western people, they couldn't access the Mississippi River. They had boundary disputes with Florida and Mississippi itself. They had to pay taxes and tariffs to use the port of New Orleans, the mouth of the river, to export anything out. And they were constantly under attack from Native Americans because the Spanish were sponsoring Native Americans to attack the colonists and vice versa. So the key with this one was the Pinckney Treaty gave the Americans absolutely everything they wanted. They got fixed borders with Florida and with the Mississippi, knowing that eventually they would have, the manpower and the numbers, obviously, to overwhelm the Spanish. They knew that the Spanish wouldn't hold on to Florida for long. And on top of that, they got access to the Mississippi River, which was fundamentally really important for the trade and development of the United States. And they got tariffs removed from New Orleans. So I think fundamentally the Americans saw that the Pinckney Treaty as like something they got everything they wanted. Whereas the Jay Treaty was different. Probably because they're negotiating with a stronger power. Britain at this point was stronger than Spain and had more influence, and Canada was a stronger position than Florida. So the problems they had with the British were that the British had been seizing their ships because they'd been trading with the French during the Revolutionary War, as the British had been taking their ships. They hadn't compensated them for the slaves that they'd freed during the War of Independence. They hadn't left their forts in the Northwest Territory, which they promised to do, and they hadn't established the boundaries with Canada. And again, the British hadn't really got proper trade. They weren't allowed to trade with the West Indies or the richer colonies in the British Empire. And again, the British and Americans were sponsoring Native American attacks against each other as well. And unlike in the Pinckney Treaty, they didn't manage to get everything they wanted. So they did get an end to hostilities between Native Americans and the British. That was one important thing. And the British did agree to abandon their northwestern forts, which was fundamentally destructive for Native Americans. Because once the British withdrew their protection of the Native Americans, their alliance with the Native Americans were inevitably going to be crushed in the West from westward expansion. So the westward expansion, they got everything they wanted in there. They got clear borders with Canada. So all these things were very similar to what they got with the Spanish. But in terms of trade, they got access to the British Empire again, but they had to sign an agreement not to join the French in the Revolutionary War. That was the price they had to pay. They also did not gain access to the West Indies for economic trade, so they weren't able to get access to those colonies. And they got the ships back. So the British agreed to compensate them or return the ships they'd seized that were trading with the French, as long as they agreed not to trade with the French anymore. But which pleased the North, because it was the North that was shipbuilding, it was the North that was manufacturing, it was the North that was exporting in and out. But the South were upset because they did not get compensation for the slaves that had been freed during the war by the British. And so therefore, especially in the South, this treaty was viewed negatively, but they didn't get as much as they got from the Spanish. But I think, again, probably that was because of the fundamental power dynamic between the two. Do you want to add anything to that?
That sounds pretty solid to me, I think.
Yeah, so I'll just run through obviously what was well and what was badly, and then we can decide. So in terms of territory, they got established borders with Florida and established borders with Canada, and the British agreed to evacuate the Northwest Territory. So those disputes over that Northwestern Territory boundaries were solved. And the Spanish had not accepted the Florida boundaries in the Treaty of Paris. And the Canadians had supported Native Americans against Americans, so had their friend. But in terms of territory, all of that was resolved by both these treaties. So I think territorially, they did a good job because they managed to get both those borders agreed. They would eventually take Florida off the Spanish, and they also gained access to the Mississippi River and no tolls for using New Orleans port. So I think fundamentally that is pretty successful in terms of territory. Would you agree?
Yeah, I do. I guess I just add that the Americans are quite lucky.
Yeah.
They're just that the Spanish Empire it's weak. It's falling apart, right?
And then the French invaded them.
There are these latent independence movements in this, in the Spanish colonies. It's not going well. There are all sorts of financial difficulties. So that's luck. If you had a very strong Spanish Empire, things probably would be different, right?
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely spreading because obviously the American Revolution spreads into Haiti, spreads into Latin America, spreads all around the world, and eventually to France itself, obviously, in a very short time. Because people look at it and go, well, hang on a minute, they successfully did this. They formed their own country. Maybe we can do this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's a very complicated question in relation to France. But I mean, from the point of view of the British, I imagine that the British wanted to be on relatively good terms with the Americans, in spite of the war, right?
Yeah.
Because a war with the American colonists gives, it has major implications, let's say, for a conflict with the other European powers.
Yeah.
Too. So it's in Britain's interest to have a relatively, at least a neutral, if not somewhat sympathetic, American state.
Yep.
And to what extent do you think that American policy about neutrality is important? I think this is in relation to the Revolutionary War in particular.
Very well. Obviously, it divided the government because Jefferson thought they owed them.
Right.
Jefferson liked perpetual revolution as well, so he was very supportive of and the Jeffersonian tradition was very supportive of the French Revolution because, of course, it's the poorer people. Jefferson's idea of the revolution was more of a class-based one, I think, than Hamilton's. But whereas Hamilton and Washington were more in favor of trading with Britain, the Federalist Party in general was more in favor of trading with Britain and reestablishing connections with Britain because it was the globe that was logically where their economy was tied in more, so it would make more sense.
Yeah, that's right. So you can imagine an argument in favor of helping the French, although there is something perfidious about it, right? Because France, the French monarchy, had in fact supported was instrumental, almost arguably instrumental in helping the Americans win the War of Independence.
Yeah.
So there's like a decent moral argument to be made to well, I mean, now that the monarchy's been overthrown, so that leads to this complication, right? Because who is the French government now? Now that you have the French Revolution.
The Hamilton musical sums that up very nicely in the rap battle about whether they stay up or not.
Yeah, I love that part of it. And I guess out of this comes this very strong. It's still present in American politics. This instinct for isolationism, to not get involved in complicated European conflicts, right?
Yeah. I mean, what it always alternates in America. Again, there's America's just like a massive mountain of contradictions and different pulls, and at different times, those one side or the other is pulling more on the strings. Moving on into war with these. So obviously, America was still technically bound by treaty. I've written to Britain, it should be to France. So when war broke out between Britain and France, eventually they could have got sucked in on the side of the French, the wrong country. And that was a danger. And Jefferson wanted this. He wanted to support the French, but for the Americans, getting sucked in was a problem because, again, even by trading with the French, their ships were being seized. And Washington and Hamilton managed to make sure that the federal government remained neutral. And this was important in order to keep peace with Britain. And like I said, Britain gave back the ships and paid compensation for this. So I think they handled it quite well in terms of coming out of it in a good position.
Could you sum it up in this way and say that in some ways, but in their hearts, right, there's a tendency to side with France against Britain, the old enemy. So that's like an emotional, it's in the heart, but America's interests is really more aligned with that of Britain, being a big naval power.
Definitely economically.
So a conflict perhaps between heart and brain.
And they still share a much closer ideology in a political and government system and idea of the world, because they're both Anglo.
Absolutely. There's some very funny misunderstandings actually between the French and the Americans diplomatically, I think, as these the French Revolution unfolds. But that's another story, something to read.
And then economics being the third factor, they had to accept the restrictions. The negative of this, they got a better deal with Spain than they got with Britain, basically. So from the Pinckney Treaty, they got access to the Mississippi River, which was a massive economic boost to the West. And there were really no negatives because the Spanish gave them everything they wanted. Whereas in the North, for the British Treaty with Treaty was not quite so clear. The North was happy because they were interested in reopening trade between Britain and the colonies, and they got that. But they didn't get everything they wanted because they still had to accept restrictions in trade imposed by the British Empire. And so the US merchants were banned from trading with the Caribbean. That did impact the North because they couldn't get rum, sugar, other factors out. And they got no compensation for freed slaves from that treaty, which was a big problem for the South. They also were not allowed to trade with France during the war, which was problematic. And the South was annoyed at the lack of access to markets and no competition for slaves, more so than the North. So again, being that Hamilton and the Federalists are negotiating these treaties, the fact that the North got what it wanted in compensation for its ships, but the South didn't for its slaves, probably